In February 1851, and note how quickly this whole story is unfolding, the construction of the building was almost complete. But what Fox and Henderson were delivering was actually a shell that had to be now accommodated for the exhibition, beginning with a big problem that had never been encountered there again at that scale, which is which color, what kind of painting in order to animate the entire buildings. The 19th century was obsessed with color. It's 19th century architects such as Jacques Kittorff, the German-born French architect, who discovered, or rather rediscovered, that Greek architecture was inseparable from color scheme. This interest in polychromy was a widely shared notion in the 19th century. So painting the Crystal Palace was at stake. But what color use? And what kind of parti, what kind of general choice in order to orient oneself? To paint the Crystal Palace, one had to move between two extremes. One extreme could have been to accentuate the immateriality of the construction, such a thin construction. Let's not forget that iron is something like 60 times more resistant than stone, which basically means that a column in iron can be 60 times smaller. So this impression of immateriality could have been reinforced by painting, for instance, everything in white. To the contrary, one could try to rather give substance to the iron. Another possibility would have been to use red, which is a color that has a tendency to make things look more closer and more present, so to paint everything in red. The color scheme that was finally chosen is actually a pretty elegant solution moving in between these two extremes. It was the work of artist Owen Jones, who was asked by Paxton and the organizer of the exhibition to actually propose a solution to paint the Crystal Palace. And here we have one of the drawings submitted by Owen Jones in order to explain his ideas. What Owen Jones proposed was actually a mix of three fundamental colors: red, blue, and yellow. Owen Jones' research and project was actually linked to also an interest in the optical and physiological properties of colors, something that had been initiated in the late 18th century, illustrated by the work of someone like Goethe with his famous theory of colors, and a question that was very much on the table in the 1850s. Owen Jones decided actually to use the blue for the web to create an impression of a complex but distant maze, with this notion that blues tend to make things recede in the background. He used the yellow as the counterpoint to make things more vividly present, and in his own approach of color, the red was kind of intermediate. The columns were actually painted in blue and yellow, so that actually they would appear having much more relief, much more movement than what they had in reality. Here we can see how complex is the scheme. You may notice, for example, the girders of the main nave are in blue, but you may notice that the beam they're supporting are painted in red. So something that, once again, through a tendency to make some objects appear as receding in the background and other appear as coming rather towards the observer, created once again this impression of animation. The Crystal Palace had presented some analogies with church, or more generally religious architecture. One must not forget that in those years, polychromy was seen as one of the characteristics of religious buildings. For example, Greek temples that I already mentioned. Here we have a Beaux-Arts reconstitution of a Greek temple, and in which we see, by the way, some of the primary colors used in the Crystal Palace. So to paint was by no means a culturally neutral decision. It really was about imparting meaning to this new construction. Of course, speaking of colors, how not to be struck by the fact that this question has reemerged with buildings like, for example, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, and more generally, I mentioned high-tech architecture. High-tech architecture very often play on colors and the contrast between colors, as if a form of modernity, a form of pleasure linked to the perception of simple colored ambiances was born with the Crystal Palace and is still with us today. If painting the Crystal Palace was already a complex problem, organizing the exhibition was another. How to classify, how to bring some orders to millions of artifacts, how to structure things that range from raw materials to machines and to even work of art. Initially, the organizers had foreseen a very clear organization of the displays, an organization reminiscent of the order used in publication like the Great Encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert. So the exhibition would have been organized in 4 parts, with the first one being raw materials, then machinery, so the machines, then manufactures, so basically industrial product, and then something very important throughout the 19th century, which is these industrial production that were close to art, such as, for example, stained glasses, enamel production, all kinds of things in between manufacturing and art. This very logical order created at least 2 problems. The first one was that actually the 4 sections were not of equivalent size. Second, such a division blurred national distinction, which was clearly something some nations did not want. The final organization was actually a compromise. It was a compromise in which national logic emerged very strongly. There again, there is in this building almost something emblematic of this new and very spectacular rise both of nation and internationalism. It was an international exhibition, but an international exhibition that showcased the industry of the various nations. The United Kingdom and its colonies occupied pretty much half of the exhibition. This is what you have on the left. And on the right, the rest of the world, which pretty much reflected at the time the difference between the industry of the United Kingdom and the industry of the rest of the world. At the time, England still produced something like half of the iron production of the world. So this is by no means far-fetched in many respects. Now, in order to have some logic in the way things were displayed, a number of choices were made. Machines were grouped on one side of the buildings. On the other side of the building, one found raw materials. And in order to make the exhibition more spectacular, the most interesting and spectacular artifacts were grouped actually in the nave. So that the final organization was a kind of compromise between national, thematic, and in some ways a logic of spectacle. And this is what made also the exhibition quite a success. Here, a couple of photographs of what was on display, especially in the nave. Some of these artifacts may seem purely artistic, like the dome that is in the rear, but which was actually a very large piece of iron produced by Coalbrookdale, the place where the first iron bridge had been built at the end of the 18th century, and which epitomized in the way the supremacy of the English ironworks. In the front, you have actually a lighthouse lantern, which was there again something pretty high-tech at the time. And you can see sculptures, you can see a whole mix of objects which are pretty typical of what may have looked at the time as a bazaar at the scale of the planet. I just showed you the British side. Now we have the rest of the world side of the nave, with there again a number of artifacts kind of surprising. For example, the 2 statues of horses that were presented by the Duke of Württemberg, which are clearly not industrial, but in between industry and traditional craft, as many of the things displayed. I won't enter into all the details of the organization that was necessary to receive all these objects coming from the entire world, to organize them, to sort them, etc. Let's just say a few things. A number of people, pretty much all kinds of resources were mobilized. The military, for example, troops were used in order just, to check in objects. There were so many of them. Also to mark things on the floor and to be sure that things were following the proper order and were brought where they had to be. But also all kinds of curators, geologists from the Natural Science Museum, artists, etc., specialists of the history of art were mobilized. The whole London was busy cataloging, putting in place the artifacts. Despite that, and although the organizers had announced that no object would be allowed to enter the Crystal Palace after the official opening, actually it took a few weeks more after the opening to put everything in place. There again, the most formidable museum that the planet had ever seen was put in place in a few weeks, probably not completely on time, but quite an achievement, which is as much about logistics than architecture than the rest of the things we've been evoking so far. Between the 1st of May 1851 and the 11th of October of the same year, day on which the exhibition was declared officially closed, some 6 million people visited the Crystal Palace. 6 million people might not seem enormous by today's standard. At the time, it was completely unprecedented. Let's also remember that it was a transcontinental exhibition. Artifacts came from Asia, from the Americas, pretty much every part of the world. So in some ways, one could say that 1851 and the Great Exhibition was the first global event. Here we have a caricature of the journal Punch, which is titled "All the World Going to See the Great Exhibition of 1851." And in some ways, this was actually pretty accurate. The exhibition was also an event in which social classes were a bit blurred. It was not only global in terms of being international, it was also global because peasant, worker came along with aristocrat, with the bourgeois, and here you have another caricature with people gawking at all these marvelous things. There again, we've got completely accustomed to this kind of spectacle, but just try to be for 5 minutes someone from 1851. You had never seen a building that large. You had never seen so much glass, so much light, so much transparency. You entered actually through a pretty cramped door, but then all of a sudden the magic operated. You found yourself under this magnificent glass dome in a kind of church of crystal with trees, with fountains, with this kind of mix of artificial and natural object. And this was only the transept. You've not yet discovered the whole thing. And then you arrive at the middle of the transept, and then the two sides of the nave, the great nave, appeared, this magic world full of fascinating objects. The whole thing was an enchantment. It was a kind of magic world, the first Wonderland, in a way the first theme park. And as we will see, Paxton did actually envisage something like a theme park in his later version of the Crystal Palace. So there again, we find this idea of a kind of giant entertainment for everyone, mixing classes. And this is probably also the great ambiguity of the industrial world that arises at the same time. That's to say, a socially stratified world in which capitalists are more and more capitalistic, but also a world in which the spectacle is for everyone. It was a magical world, a world full of objects, of things, of stuff. This is where, to use a kind of Marxian grid of analysis, this is where the realm of merchandise begin to emerge. All this stuff accumulated, and of course with a pleasure that has to do with the never exhausted desire to see, to possess, to touch, to experience. A world in which, by the way, repetition and uniqueness go together. We have again the horses of the Duke of Württemberg in the middle of all these repetitive girders and columns. This world in which would invent psychoanalysis to try to understand what was at stake in this endless mix of repetition and uniqueness, desire and monotony. Walter Benjamin, the German late 19th century, early 20th century German philosopher, wrote a number of pages about the flaneur and how Parisian it is. But one must imagine that actually the flaneur was as much a London creature, one of the visitors of this world contained into a single building, as Ruskin would have it, in the moments in which he did not find the whole enterprise completely disputable. The Crystal Palace and the Great Exhibition played also a seminal role in the development of the new design ideal of the industrial world, among which we found the desire to return to a quality of craft that industry seemed to challenge. Such was, for example, the meaning of the medieval court organized by Pugin, in which the idea was to suggest that one could reconcile the industrial age with the quality of former ages, beginning with the craft of the Middle Ages. Many of these artifacts can still be seen today in the Victoria and Albert's Museum, where they have been carefully preserved. I mentioned the role of craft. Here is the section on stained glasses. Let's not forget, by the way, that the 19th century built hundreds, if not thousands, of churches. And stained glasses, was stained glasses a craft or an industry? We are there confronted with another of the ambiguity of the industrial age. Here we see again this strange world of, magnificent, surprising object. Something almost, of course, this is not yet the period of department store, but we can understand also the continuity between the wonders of 19th century department stores and a place like the Crystal Palace and the Great Exhibition.